following Bob is never an easy thing to do. So I really appreciate being here today, although all three of us are a little intimidated. But if you can do the next slide, please, Shawn. It's your job. So we've been introduced. I was from the District of Columbia. I was the director of the Department on Disability Services for over 8 years. And the Department on Disability Services is a combined agency. So it's the Developmental Disabilities Administration, and it was also the Vocational Rehabilitation Services Administration, including blind services. Not was, it still is, excuse me. And I recently voluntarily left my post after filing our last compliance with that Evans litigation. And so I'm going to start it off today, and then Erin and Stephen are going to do a good bit of this work, and I'll do some closing comments. So we are going to talk about why we started this. This is going to be a pretty nuts and bolts presentation. That's what states do, even though Shawn called this a district. We don't consider ourselves a district. We have the full responsibilities of a state. And so it is very nuts and bolts, but we'll try to put things in context. And while it is also there will be a lot of flavor about developmental disabilities, certainly through the beginning. We will certainly highlight how much of this, all of this, applies really to any population group. We're going to talk as well about how important it is as you roll out initiatives, be it the federal government or a state, how important it is that you integrate these initiatives. They do not stand alone. And if you allow things to stand alone, all you inevitably do is fragment your system and confuse your stakeholders because they think it's the next flavor of the month, rather than showing how these things are really building upon and integrating the work. We'll talk about the pursuit of the district's efforts in No Wrong Door and how that's now transforming all of LTSS across the district. And talk a little bit, really not at the end because I had to do this presentation, but really try to infuse throughout the presentation, while it's not necessarily highlighted in the slides, how this work really supports the HCBS settings rules, compliance with Olmstead and the ADA. So that's what we're going to talk about today. If you can do the next. So I wanted to just kind of highlight why we started this in the district at specifically in the Developmental Disabilities Administration, because we started this in 2011, 2012, and that was certainly before the new ACA rules came out, the new settings rules came out. So why did we begin what was a person-centered thinking? And if you notice, I use person-centered thinking, PCT, not person-centered planning, because what Shawn kind of referred to was, and what I say to audiences nationally, person-centered planning, we've been doing that forever. What's the big deal? Well, we've been doing person-centered planning forever, particularly in the developmental disabilities arena, but we've really not been doing person-centered planning, and we've just allowed it to become a bureaucratic process. So why we started it was, particularly in the district, we had a very antiquated developmental disability services system. So while some were a little more advanced, ours was not. We were still very much a medical model, built on an intermediate care facility system. We had a very young home and community-based services waiver that the first one was not approved until 2000, which was 20 years after the rest of the nation, and it really wasn't well utilized at all until 2007. So we had a very immature home and community-based services system. Through my tenure, I started there in, when did I start? 2007. Through that process in the first several years, self-advocates really got a very strong voice within the government, and so they were starting to be very vocal about how they were treated and what their lack of voice and their lack of respect that they had from the system. And we also had a bunker mentality. We had fought for the past several years to fight off receivership, many court battles, and so our whole system had become extraordinarily compliance-focused. And when you become compliance-focused, you are not thinking about the person. You are thinking about the regulation. And the regulation at all odds, irrespective of what a person might think. And so I really had felt that we had gotten to a certain point in our system change effort and couldn't get any further without really infusing into the system a heavy emphasis on values. Because without the values, we really couldn't make that next shift to start thinking about what's the next level of systems change that the district really needed. So that's why we started heavily investing in what's called person-centered thinking in 2012. So this print is a little small. I apologize for that. But here, what I need to emphasize, and what's not on the screen, is a number of things. One is building that capacity for person-centered thinking, but also then braiding those initiatives that we had been pursuing through the district. But I wanted to step back a minute and really talk about, before I get into some of the details, some of the key elements you need in pushing forward systems change. So I don't have the academic slide up because I'm not an academic, but when I saw an academic put it up, I thought, well, yeah, everybody knows that. But I thought, well, maybe they don't, so I should speak about it. But it's really true. To really put forward some major systems change, first you need the leadership commitment. And if you don't have that from the top, and being able to express that extensively over time, you aren't going to get that systems change. And being able to communicate that verbally, in your documents, in your planning, you have to have that leadership commitment over time. When it comes to training, you heard Shawn speak about that. You can't train people once and think that, okay, now go forth and do it. When I presented with the CMS TA, I presented with a professor, and she called it train and spray, or spray and train, and then pray that, and pray that it will stick. And so that was that same concept, that you can't just deliver a training like person-centered planning and then think that everybody's going to go run off and carry out what that's supposed to mean. I shouldn't say this, but initially our Medicaid agency, which Shawn mentioned, contacted us about 18 months ago and said, oh, you know, the new rules are out. We need to do person-centered planning in the aging and disability services. Can you do an hour-long training for all of our case managers in the EPD waiver on person-centered planning so we'll be in compliance? And we just started laughing and said, no, we can't do that. And eventually pulled them through on No Wrong Door to bring them to the reality of what that takes. So continuous training, it has to go on forever. It needs to be both horizontal and vertical. And so what you'll find is that in our training here, what we did was we started in 2012, And we started with just a 2-day training, excuse me, not a 2-hour, but a 2-day training, which is our introductory training. And we didn't just stop there. You heard Shawn mention you can't just train service coordinators. Then they're in an island, or case managers, whatever you call them. Then they're in an island trying to do person-centered planning, and nobody else knows what they're talking about or has any kind of exposure to the values that you're trying to impart. So we immediately required to start, all of the department staff had to go through the 2-hour training, no matter what role or responsibility that you had. It had to then be followed up. As I said, you can't just do training and then say, go do it. So we followed that with ongoing coaching and mentoring by initially consultants who would come every couple weeks and provide on-site coaching and mentoring. What did you do? How did it go? Did that make sense? What barriers did you experience, until they could be replaced by our own trainers? And then you have to expand that horizontally. And so then in subsequent years, we pushed that out to be in our community of practice with supporting families, and trained family members on person-centered thinking and person-centered planning. And then we moved it out further, and you'll hear from Stephen about training self-advocates and having them be trained as trainers on how to plan together. It's called people planning together. So you had to push it out horizontally. And then we pushed it out to our provider organizations. And a number of them went through an experience that you'll hear about on how to become a person-centered thinking organization. So it couldn't just be a single training event, nor could it just be a single type of training. It had to really go down vertically in terms of the style and type of training, and then horizontally across your stakeholder system. And then service coordinators as well, they then got an additional training, a 12-part series that went beyond the 2 days, that really went into the greater detail of conducting those meetings, developing those plans, really the more fine details of how do you actually carry that out into practice. So it's really critical when we talk about training. It's not a session like this, and then you can go on and think that your system will transform. A long multi-year process. And then finally, you have to follow that up with the tools to see if it works. Number one, so your supervisory system has to have tools to help evaluate whether those employees and those systems are actually carrying out those principles in practice. You have to be able to document that so you can benchmark whether in fact it's working. And then your quality assurance and regulatory system also has to then build in and embed those same principles in practice and be able to then enforce that over time, or particularly your provider network is not going to take it seriously. So there's that overarching element of having to make sure that you have a very multifaceted approach to building that capacity. We also did person-centered, I'll step back. So that kind of thing. And then how we also recognized that it was very important to braid our initiatives. So we were very aggressive to go after initiatives offered by the Administration on Community Living, AIDD. So we became one of the 5 states. If you want to do the next slide. In the next slide, please, Shawn. That's okay. In the supporting, back one. There you go, supporting families, community of practice. I assume people here know about that. But that really is focusing on how do you support people in your community to create those systems that are going to support people where they live. And so we were one of those original 6 states to participate in that. And again, the first thing that we did in that first year was take that community practice through intensive person-centered planning and thinking, and use those same tools with them to help them plan, help them really develop what their goals would be for that five-year project. So again, making sure that was braided. If you want to do the next slide. And I just wanted to point this out for those of you who don't know why it's so important that we focused on how are we going to support families and people with, in this case, developmental disabilities in the community where they live, is this slide is that indicating nationally that 75% of all people with developmental disabilities are not even receiving formal services from state government. And that 75% represents 3-point-some million people. And while that's for developmental disabilities, I can assure you that kind of percentage is representative of the aging population. We all know that the vast majority of people who are aging are not in formal services and supports, and likewise people with physical disabilities are not receiving formal services and supports. And as our system continues to evolve and age and more people need assistance, that number is staggering, and there is no way that particularly out-of-home services are something that we're going to want or something that we can afford as a nation. And so it's critical that these efforts all work together. So if you can do the next slide. Oh, back one. I just wanted to highlight this, from those initial 3 years. So this is a long time. We kind of came out again from the developmental disability perspective with a number of priorities for that next level of systems change. Obviously, comprehensive supports, coordinated lifespan supports, which certainly speaks to the no wrong door. Person and family-centered supports really is that person-centered thinking, peer support, and self-determination and supported decision-making. And all these things work together. And we really use this as our platform to go after the no wrong door as well. Because you have, in no wrong door, you're speaking about crossing now LTSS population groups. So take away the DD, and this can apply now to behavioral health, people who are aging, people with other disabilities. And this is really what the district had to accomplish and had to really tackle for the whole LTSS system. We also, in the No Wrong Door project, as we were applying for the planning grant, we were looking at the end of one administration and the beginning of another. We're on a federal fiscal year, and so we went after the No Wrong Door grant as a methodology by which to kind of tie in the next administration, if you will, into what we had started and what to in kind of our values. And we thought, well, if we get the planning grant, the next administration is kind of has to carry it out, no matter what they think. So we didn't know what they thought at the time. So we wrote it knowing that we were in a bridge year, and really did it in a way to hopefully kind of rope in the future administration, the future set of directors of those other LTSS services. And so we were successful in doing that. We got the planning grant, and thankfully the new administration did embrace that. And what their feedback that the new administration was getting was that while we had certainly a lot of resources, people in the city really didn't know about LTSS and were not happy with it. And so the mayor's office really embraced that effort. So where we are in this timeline is the next. Again, this is a little hard to see, but we're now coming to a close. Not we anymore, so Erin and Steve. We're now coming to a close in our timeline, and now we are really expanding no wrong door implementation of person-centered thinking, and have a lot of things up ahead. So I'm going to turn this over. We've made huge strides in the developmental disability system, behavioral health, which we are not really going to highlight a lot today. They started as well in about 2014 an equally robust person-centered thinking and planning initiative. And they really did the same thing. They started with training. They spread it across their service delivery system, not just their staff, but their providers. Then they incorporated it into their quality and into their supervisory structures. So they started probably about 2 years after us, but they are fully engaged in their efforts, and so now it's kind of mirroring and now integrating with the No Wrong Door practice, as is the VR. And Erin will talk about a lot with aging and disability systems and how that's being integrated and spread out. So it works, I can tell you that, and we've actually seen the outcomes, and perhaps we'll get to talk about that, actual concrete outcomes that are measurable as a result of this multi-year effort.